Now Jesus sat opposite the treasury and saw how the people put the money into the treasury. And many who were rich put in much. But the poor widow came and threw in 2 mints, which make 2 quadrants. So he called his disciples to himself and said to them, Surely I say to you, the poor widow who puts in more than all of those put together into the treasury. For they all put in out of their abundance, but she put in poverty, in putting all that she had in her whole livelihood.
Do want to welcome anyone who happens to be watching via our YouTube channel. And again, very nice to see a number of people who watch on a regular basis. Just make everyone aware that we do have developing again after all the COVID things an all-age time, typically once a month at the bottom end of the month. And Neil, thankfully, is going to be helping me with that, sort of an every other month kind of thing. And lots of good things we've got planned. And we've got a theme for this year for the all-age times. It's going to be everything water, by the way, everything water, and hopefully that'll sort of reveal itself as time goes on. Yeah, now we won't be fetching a swimming pool in, but we can talk about that. Let me get outside. There we go. I don't know if you've ever heard of the little phrase, less is more. You heard of that? Yeah. Come to find out, the chap who actually sort of coined that phrase is an architect. And his whole idea was to make architecture not so sort of out there, but to make it simple, to make it sort of pleasant on the eye, but very, very simple. Very, very simple. And this sort of applies to so many different things. And hopefully you will be able to understand what we're on about here as we get into this in Mark chapter 12. The world system has always been at odds, or seemingly quite often opposite to the way God works. If you can quickly turn there to the Old Testament, Ezekiel 14. Now, I don't know, we've been a very long time since we've been there. Ezekiel, so that's about 100 pages to the west of Mark chapter 12, okay? I'll give you a second to find that if you want to find it. It's only one verse we're going to look at, but it's a very interesting verse we're just going to touch on and use as a bit of a springboard into what we want to look at today. I came across this Ezekiel chapter 14, verse 14. So 14:14 in Ezekiel. Ezekiel's speaking about, as most of the prophets do, that warning of judgment to Judah and Israel, saying you better be careful, you need to get yourself sorted, and all these things are going to happen. The people from Assyria and then Babylon and all these complicated things back in the Old Testament. But there's a little bit of something that pops up in Ezekiel chapter 14:14 that absolutely floored me. And I want you to see what it says here. So Ezekiel's speaking, and he says this. Even if these 3 men, he mentions 3, Noah, Daniel, and Job, even if these 3 were in it, they would deliver only themselves by their righteousness, says the Lord God. Ezekiel is speaking about the judgment coming. And he says, listen, even if Daniel, Job, and who's the other one? Noah, well done. Even if those 3 were there, God would spare them, but only them. Isn't it an interesting list that Ezekiel gives us? What was there about those 3 that was unique? That made me scratch my head quite a bit. Let's just think just for a minute as we come into this chapter in Mark chapter 12. These 3. Noah. Noah was the wacko that God told to build the boat, to build this ark, And it took him, most guesses are, somewhere between 55 to 75 years to build this ark. Can you imagine a building project taking 55 to 75 years? Couldn't imagine that. I mean, if it takes me a month to decorate my bedroom and get my bedroom sorted, I think that's long enough. Thankfully, we had sort of someone come in and within a day's time sort the whole thing out. Very thankful for that. But 75 years, 55 years maybe even, to build this boat. He was preaching the same sermon every Sunday. It's gonna rain. It's gonna rain. Same sermon every Sunday. That's what Noah did. What do you think people thought of him on the day? Was he well respected? Did people say, Noah, aren't you doing a great job? I wouldn't think so. They say, Noah, what in the world are you doing? And there are people, now I'm not sure I'm clever enough to be able to state this as a fact, but there's a lot of people who would say that the earth up until that time had never even seen rain, that the earth was watered from below, and we won't get into that, but certainly the concept of a worldwide flood was a brand new thing. No one would even have ever thought of that. There was Noah. But then there was the chap called Daniel. He was the displaced wacko who devoted his life to God and earned a death sentence by being cast into the lion's den. And did God preserve him? Yes, he did. Yes, he did. Then there was Job. Job. Well, I've invested many, many hours into looking into Job. This was the wacko who stayed faithful to God despite losing everything except his life. And he went through many, many, many spiritual battles. Noah, Daniel, and Job. Ezekiel says that even if those three men were there, God would only have spared them, speaking about this coming judgment. It's interesting, not just who was listed, but I find it even more interesting who wasn't listed. Who wasn't listed? Let me give you a few names who weren't listed. Abraham wasn't listed. Why? Moses, Charlton Heston, he wasn't listed. Why? David, King David, wasn't listed. And what I came to conclude was this. Abraham and Moses and David and others, these were exalted leaders that people looked up to and said, wow, look at them. Aren't they amazing people, amazing leaders? Now, obviously, not everybody absolutely loved them, but they had this thing going on within the area that they lived. But Noah, Daniel, and Job were sort of lone rangers. If I say lone rangers, is that okay? Does anyone remember? Lone Ranger? Tonto? We all there? Okay. Hi-ho silver and all that sort of thing? Jimmy, some of you who have fewer birthdays enough has no idea what I'm talking about. Okay? So Google it, Lone Ranger, and you'll see what I'm talking about. These three who stood strong despite the incredible difficulties that they lived in. There was no one, or not many certainly, who looked up at them and said, aren't they amazing leaders? Aren't they amazing people? They were obscure individuals, but they trusted God during incredibly difficult circumstances. And they had no idea, I'm convinced, they had no idea the impact they were going to have in years to come. I bet you, as Job went through everything that he did, loss of all of his family, loss of all his livelihood, everything, he had no idea for the next thousands of years the comfort that his experience would give to so many people who are going through incredible pain and difficulty in not understanding this massive question that we always want to know the answer to. And the question is, why? Why? Now, I will tell you that Job never got the answer to why. And that's one of the huge lessons in the book of Job. Job saw God in a much bigger way, although God never told him why. Possibly when Job would get to heaven, he would have got a deeper understanding. But that's one of the important things that he experienced. He saw God in a much bigger way, and God never told him why all those things are happening. So today we're going to visit with another individual sort of that category. One of these obscure people that has this particular experience, and we're going to put her in this category of less is more. Less is more. Now, in the book of Mark, we've been through so many things. Now, for our visitors this morning, we have been working through the book of Mark for, 28 years now or something like that? It's been close to that. For a while, we've been sort of marching through Mark. And today, we're going to come up to this particular account. And this sort of came about in a roundabout way. This is the last sort of interaction Jesus has with somebody in the book of Mark before all the crucifixion events. And I'm wondering if Mark put this in this place now, where it is, to emphasize to us this particular lady and how important this is. So we're going to give you some sort of labels here as we go through, and sort of film kind of theme. Okay. So first of all, we're going to look at the trailer. We're going to look at the trailer. I don't know when the last time you've been to the cinema is. By the way, I hear they've got the Savoy open in Doncaster. Quite the posh place from what I hear. So if you get a chance, go check out the Savoy, the new theater down in Doncaster. The trailer. We're going to get the trailer. We're going to backtrack just a little bit into verse 38 through 40. So chapter 12. Verse 38 through 40. Let me read that, and we're going to get a bit of a run-up, a bit of a trailer to what is happening in this passage we're looking at today. The Bible says this in verse 38. It says, "Then he said to them in his teaching, 'Beware of the scribes, those who desire to go around in long robes, who love greetings in the marketplaces, and the best seats in the synagogues, and the best places at the feast, who,'" this is interesting, "'who devour widows' houses.'" What's that all about? "'And for a pretense make long prayers. These will receive greater condemnation.'" Now we're going to get to that in just a second. But we need to backtrack just a little bit. We need to remind ourselves the journey that Jesus had done, the things that have been happening these last few Sundays leading up to where we are in Mark chapter 12. First of all, if you remember, there is that first group, and these various groups had arrived to try and trip Jesus up. Now, we've been on this for 2 or 3 Sundays now. If you remember, a few Sundays ago, first there were the Pharisees and the Herodians. The Pharisees and the Herodians. The Pharisees is a group we're quite familiar with. They're the ones who came up with all these laws and all these kind of things. And then there were the Herodians who tried to cozy up to the government. We found and we discovered that they didn't work together normally. They didn't like each other. However, if they had a common enemy, then they were friends. All right? And the question is, should we pay taxes to Caesar or not? You remember Jesus' answer? He said, okay, give me a coin. And he looked at that coin, and what did he say? Give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and give to God what belongs to God. And they said, what an answer. We weren't expecting that. Fail. Then there was a second group that came up to him. These were the Sadducees. They came up with this story, this fairy tale. They said there was a woman and her wife, and they couldn't have any children, and the poor bloke died, and then she ended up marrying his brother, and so forth and so on, until all 7 brothers, remember, 7, had married her. There were no children, and then the question was, in the resurrection, which these Sadducees did not believe in, right? In the resurrection, whose wife is she going to be? Because she married all 7. And Jesus, they were hoping again to trip him up, and Jesus came back and said, no, wait a minute. You don't understand that God's got a different system that's going to happen in eternity. They said, well, didn't succeed there. Then there was the third group, that of the scribes. The scribes. The scribes were the teachers. They were the learned people. A scribe, you thought normally is the chappie who sits down and writes things down. Well, that's part of it, because it wasn't an assumed thing that everyone could read, everyone could write. These were the educated people. These were the teachers. These were the scholars of the time. And the question came in, which is what we looked at last time we were in Mark, was what was the greatest commandment? And then we looked at all of those things. So each one of those 3 groups, Jesus addressed. In each one of those 3 groups, they failed on tripping Jesus up, which was pretty much part and parcel, right? They tried to get him. It didn't work out. They said, Then Jesus said, okay, now it's my turn. So there's some parting comments here. There's some parting comments to set up this next section. As we read, he said, beware the scribes, the ones he was just speaking to. Now these, like going around the marketplace, banging the drums, making these long prayers. Why? To be able to speak to God? No. It was all about appearance. It was all about trying to look holy. It was all about trying to impress people. Is that where it's all at? No, it's not. And Jesus said the greater condemnation is going to come to them. But then there was a little note. There was a little addition that Jesus put in here. Notice what he said. Notice what he said. In verse, make sure you get the right one here now. Jesus said, who devour widows' houses. Devour widows' houses. Now, what does that mean? What does that mean? Well, the scribes, because they didn't earn a salary as such, they would make sort of it would be an offering kind of system. But the problem was these scribes would take advantage of the widows. They would take advantage and say, you need to give me this amount of money for doing this particular service for you, whatever that could be. And Jesus said, no, what they were doing, they were taking advantage. They were wrong. The greater condemnation is going to come to them. So this was the setup now for what was going to be happening in verse 41 through 44. Now let's take a look at this. Now we want to come to the main feature. Here's the main feature. It says, now, here was Jesus. He sat opposite the treasury and saw how the people put money into the treasury, and many who were rich put in much. So here was the setting. The setting was in the temple. The large building where the Jews would gather, those believers would gather for all different sorts of things, for the sacrifices, for prayer, for all kinds of things. Now, there were, by that time, do you remember who was the one that actually built the first temple? Do you know there was more than one temple, by the way? Okay, Solomon. Okay, Solomon. Now, let me show you something here. We've got a picture here. Hopefully you can see it. This building right here, this is sort of a comparison. This would have been, in relative size, Solomon's temple. Solomon's temple, the temple that Solomon built, who was David's son. David's son. There is, and after a period of time, it was neglected, it needed great repairs and so forth and so on. So then there was a chappie who came up, who was one of the kings, one of the leaders, Herod. You're probably familiar with him, one of the Herods. Herod came along and he said, listen, we need to get this thing sorted. Herod spent incredible amounts of money, and Herod had this temple built. just before the time coming up to Jesus' time. So what do you see between the two? What do you see?
Bigger, isn't it?
Much bigger. I mean, it was huge. It was huge. And right around this area, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't get up. All right. So there's an area right here called the Women's Courtyard. The courtyard. Women's Courtyard, that was what it is called. There was, right around that area, roughly 12 little boxes of quite, fancy sort of boxes that people would put money in, often maybe for the Passover, different sorts of things. They would put money in as an offering. That's what they would do. Now, I find it interesting, out of this entire courtyard, and probably those places would have been quite small, because this is a massive space. And so this is, if I could, from there to there is roughly 100 meters. So this whole structure is probably 300 to 400 meters long. It was massive. It was massive. So I find it interesting that Jesus sat himself right there where this action was going to happen, where this event was going to happen. And do you think it was an accident that Jesus happened to be there at the time this woman happened to show up? Amongst the crowd who was giving all this money, there was this little widow woman. What did Jesus say about the scribes and the widows? That they would take advantage of the widows. You remember we said that? Right. So then, come to that in just a second. There is some of my attempt. This particular picture, I sort of struggled getting it in the right place. But this particular picture shows a picture of the coins that the woman would have dropped into the box, and we'll give a sort of an amount for that in just a second. But let's come up now to this particular woman, and this was what we're going to call the leading role. This widow woman was the leading role. Now I'll give you some great, deep theological things about this woman. This widow woman. Okay, first of all, she was a widow. Okay? She was a widow. Eric, what's the point of that? Well, for one thing, it's clear from the Bible that she was poor. And at that time in history, if you were a widow, you were poor. Why? Because your husband would have been the source of income. That was just the way the culture was. There was no one to care for her. As a matter of fact, quite often she would have looked down upon. Why? Because her husband would have died. She was a widow. Her husband would have died. And the common understanding was that God's judgment was on her because her husband died. Okay? This is this whole condemnation thing that if everything is going well, then God has his thumbs up to you. If life is being in trouble, then God has his thumbs down on you. This is common. This is one of the whole big themes of Job. The three friends come in and say, Job, you must have sinned. Look at all the trouble you've got. Look at all the problems you've had. Surely there must be sin in your life. By the way, don't go down that track. Okay? Massive numbers of lessons in there. And this is part of the problem that we have. And we're very good at condemning ourselves, judging ourselves. Okay? How many times have we said, oh no, look what's happening in my life. God must be angry with me. I must have done something wrong. Maybe there's some sin in my life. Now, I'm not saying as a believer, don't think about that. But don't come to the conclusion just because you've got issues or problems and difficulties in your life that means God is angry with you and God's sin. No. Maybe God is trying to teach you a lesson. Maybe God is trying to get to you in some way to teach you something that's going to be incredibly powerful down the road. Oddly enough, this came up about 30 or 45 minutes ago, just speaking with someone just before the service, okay? So this is not an unusual thing. This happens again and again and again and again. So quite probably, this woman was looked down upon. Her husband died, possibly very much. People said, God's judging you. However, the New Testament church, that brand new thing that was developing, they were meant to care for. Matter of fact, Paul speaks specifically about these widows. Do you know what Paul says about them? That they were to care for those widows. They were to take care of them. Because the government wouldn't. There was no NHS. There was no welfare system. There was no benefits. So these dear ladies were out on their own, quite probably sat beside the road with a tin out, begging, and there's no one else that would look after them. So Paul said to those churches, listen, you need to take care of them. You need to look after them. So number one, this was a widow. And number two, she was a woman. It's pretty deep, right? Pretty deep. She was a widow woman. She was a widow. Secondly, she was a woman. In that time, in that culture, she did not have a man's status. Now, for Jesus, who is the rabbi, who is the teacher, and for Jesus to say these kind of things about a woman and then condemn these men, wow, that was quite a statement. I mean, Jesus would have gotten a lot of flack for that, and he did. And he did. But Jesus wanted to note that particular woman. And he said, listen, lads, I want you to notice what's happening here. I want you to see what's happening here. Because then, once Jesus introduces this, in verse 41, verse 41 brings in, Jesus sat opposite the treasure. He sat in a place to be able to see everything that was happening. He was watching people as they brought in their offering. And I can imagine there's the ones who had the bags of gold. And maybe they'd make a big show of it. They'd walk around. Look at me. Ready? Here goes. All the clanking as it goes down inside the box. And everyone would be maybe, I can't believe how much money they gave. Wasn't that fantastic? Oh, they must be so spiritual. They must be so close to God. Isn't that fantastic? And they walk. Yeah. That's me. That's me. And I can imagine as Jesus was watching that, maybe he had his arms crossed, saying, they've really got something wrong here. But then, there's this little lady. We don't know how old she was. We don't know. We don't know if she was a younger woman and her husband died early on. We don't know. We don't know if she was an older lady. Her husband died of just natural cause. We don't know. We don't know. But we do know she was a widow and she was a woman. And she came up, quite possibly, with her old clothes on, maybe even a little hood over her head, with her 2 little coins in her hand. And amongst the din of everybody else, she walks up and very, very humbly, plunk, plunk, 2 little copper coins into the box on top of the bags of gold that everyone else brought in. And Jesus watched her. And he called the disciples over. He said, listen. He goes, listen. We're going to turn the camera over to the money box. He said, the people with all the money, they gave out of their abundance. Why, they had stacks and stacks and stacks at home. They just grabbed something and said, we'll just give this and get everyone to look at how spiritual we are, how good we are. And they would have thrown that money in and people would have clapped or made a big deal in their minds, and they would have walked away quite proud of what they'd done. But this little woman, now, we already said she was a woman, she was a widow. And let's just give a little bit of understanding about sort of what she gave. Now, she gave what was called a lepta. A lepta. Can you say that with me? 1, 2, 3. Lepta. 2 little lepta. Which was equal to a quadrantas. Can you say that with me? Quadratas. Something like that. Okay? Good. And that was equal to 1/64 of a denarius. Okay, denarius. 1, 2, 3. Denarius. Well done. So quadratas was 1/64 of a denarius. A denarius was equal to a day's wage. I got out my calculator and did a little bit of maths. Okay? If for example, is happening today. If, for example, okay, what's minimum wage today? Anybody know? Yeah, £8.91. £8.91. If a worker worked for 8 hours at £8.91 an hour, if you take 1/64 of that, that is about £1.11. £1.11. So if this story was happening today, this dear woman gave £1.11 in the collection. But the Bible says she gave everything that she had. Now wait, so how'd she, well, I don't know how she ate. I don't know. Now, here's the thing, and this is always, when we mention this, it's always, people can misunderstand. Jesus did not condemn those who gave the large sums. I kind of threw in the extra bits about walking around proudly. We don't know. But here's what I do know. I love reading the stories, and I brought this up before. It's important to remember this. I love reading the stories of those who have material means. Those whom God has blessed financially, and they turn around and they bless others with their finances. Whew. You need to get some of those stories and read them. That'll challenge you. There's this chap that I mentioned before, R.J. Letourneau. He was obviously from French descent. He was an American who designed and built the early earth-moving machines. He came with this little tagline that says, "God can shovel it in faster than I can shovel it out." So if you go around the world today, he has built hospitals, orphanages, schools, universities all around the world with the money that God has given him, and he still died a millionaire. Still. Why? Because he was one of these that God looked at the heart. He said, wow, he's got the heart that I could just shovel to him, and he'll shovel it out as fast as I can shovel it in. What an amazing thing. So please don't misunderstand me that if there's a person with means, if there's a person with money, that is not a bad thing. Jesus didn't condemn this, but the Bible does say we cannot serve money and God at the same time. We have to make one or the other God. Okay? If God is our God and God uses us to be able to be a blessing to others, fantastic. But Jesus looked at this woman and said, listen, she gave more than all these others. What a statement. What a statement. Less is more. Less is more. So we turn to camera 2. And this was Jesus' lesson. He said, this woman who gave so much more, she gave all that she had. All that she had. Now, I don't know what all the details of that were. I don't know. The Bible does say, he calls disciples. Assuredly, in verse 43, assuredly that this woman has put in more than all those who given in the treasury. Verse 44, for they put in out of their abundance, and she put in out of her poverty, put in all that she had, her whole livelihood. You know what? I don't know what she did for food the next day, but I kind of reckon in some way, shape, or form, God took care of her. You know, God's good at doing that. He's good at doing that. And I always get the question, Eric, you've got an engineering degree. Eric, why, if you would have stayed with what you did, goodness, by now, you could be making this much money. I don't know. How can you say, if I had not packed in the job and done the ministry thing, well, I don't know what would have happened. But here's what I can say. It has been an incredibly exciting journey, watching God provide in sometimes the most unusual ways ever. And I don't know if I've ever told you this story, but I'll briefly mention it and then I'm going to finish up. Back when Courtney, our oldest, was born in the States, we had to have insurance. There was no NHS in the States. We have insurance. And I was into my training for Bible stuff, but I was working a job. And I got this bill from the hospital. Got this bill from the hospital. It's for $300. And I'm thinking, blimey, I just got done paying my school bill. How in the world am I going to have to, where am I going to come up with $300 from? And lo and behold, it's one of those stories that the next day went to the little post box where you put the little key in, you open the door, and there was an envelope in it. And in the envelope was a check. And if I can remember, it was right around $300. I can't remember where the check was from. I'm just simply saying, God is good at providing in ways that, and then you've got a story to tell. Isn't that exciting? Isn't that amazing? Here it is, this widow woman. What an amazing story she has to tell. So now we want to come and sort of finish this up. We want to ask the question, so what's the point? What is the point? Eric, where do I fit in? And what does all this mean to me? Well, number one, God's measure of giving in time and resources, it's not the amount that you give. It's not the amount that you give, but far more what you have left over. Okay? Eric, does that mean I'm not supposed to give everything? No. It's much more about the heart, as I said. Much more about the heart. Number two. Eric, what's this mean for me? Number two. That your place in God's story is not built upon your wealth or social status or your job. It's built on your faithfulness to a faithful God. And I love the bit in Matthew that there was the believer who arrived up in heaven and God said, "Well done, good and wealthy believer." Did you say that? No. Did he say, "Well done, good and handsome believer"? No, he didn't say that. This is what, that's right. Thank you, Simon, for that. Good job. And I'm glad he didn't say good and follically blessed. Follically blessed means having a lot of hair. Good and follically blessed believer. I'm glad he's not going to say that. But he does. He does say good and faithful servant. He brings out that word faithful. Out of all the words that could have been used, of all the words, faithful was the word that was used. You know what? God just wants us to be faithful to whatever He's called us to do. And it's different for everyone in this room. Different. And the last thing I want to bring out is this. This woman, she had no idea of the significance of her story. She had no idea. I seriously doubt that she even saw Jesus across the way. Seriously doubt it. But she would have no idea that her story would be told on the, what's today? 5th. Is that 5th? 5th of September, 2021. She had no idea. She had no idea the influence that she would have had on thousands and millions of believers throughout history. For the example of giving out of a heart of love. And for that is her story. That is her story. Now, I want to leave you with this. Each one of us here, every one of us here, if you're here as a believer, as a follower of Jesus, you have a story. What is your story? Is your story that of faithfulness through difficult times? Did this widow woman have some difficult times? You better believe it. Did Job have some difficult times? You better believe it. Did Daniel have some difficult times? Yeah, I'm not sure, maybe he thought he was going to be lion food or not, I don't know. Maybe he just trusted God. He trusted God throughout that whole thing, I do know that. Did Noah have some difficult times? You think he got some stick from people who are saying, "No, what in the world are you doing? Well, you're building a boat, why? You must be nuts. You must be a wacko. You must be crazy." Yeah, but they are faithful to what God called them to do. That was their story. And your story is going to be different. But you have a story. But then our church has a story as well. And I'm not sure yet what our story is going to be. I don't know. I don't know. But here's the thing I do know. I want my story to be, I want people to say, not that Eric was handsome, because they're not going to say that, right? They're not going to say that. They're not going to say Eric is wealthy. I guarantee you that. They're not going to say that. They're not going to say Eric had a nice light show at Christmas. They're not going to say that because people forget about that stuff quickly. I hope they'll say that Eric was faithful. I hope. And then here's the thing. It doesn't take any skill to be faithful. It doesn't take any money, does it? It doesn't take good looks. It doesn't take talent. It doesn't take any of that sort of stuff. It's saying, I'm going to follow God in whatever my calling, my path is, and I'm going to do that. Just like that little widow woman. She had no idea the influence that she was going to have over the hundreds and thousands of years. And here's the thing I'm convinced of. I wonder if there's people here even today that's something that you can do, something you can be, have an influence on somebody that's going to have a ramification, that's going to have a knock-on effect down the road. That your story could be in Mark chapter 12, verse 41 through 44, just like the widow woman.